Now for the next segment, we have Rishad coming back again. As you know, he needs no introduction, but he's the Chief Strategy Officer at Wipro, has been involved in the tech industry for a long time. And we thought it would be great to have him do a fireside chat with someone who is very familiar to all of us, Vikram Chandra. And Vikram has his own new avatar now, Editor G, right? And as you know, he was very famous on NDTV, doing a lot of things like Reality Check and Gadget Guru and many other things. I want to welcome both of them to come on stage for a fireside chat.
You know you're not a startup person when you're dressed the way I'm dressed.
Well, theoretically these days I've now got used to wearing jeans to office, which is the best part about moving from a corporate to a startup, I can tell you, is the ability to wear jeans and T-shirts to work. It's a great thing. We're going to be talking about the entire relationship between big corporates and between startups. But actually, let me just dive straight into it. As somebody who's been in the corporate world for 20 to 24 years, quit a couple of years back to launch a startup. Let me first get your advice, now that I have done it, and now that we are sitting in front of all these people. Tell me honestly, was that the right decision or the wrong decision?
To leave NDTV and do a startup?
Yeah.
No, I think, look, if you have an idea and you're committed and passionate about it, you must go for it. I think the opportunity is ripe. There's so much opportunity, and you were telling me about the idea you're focused on. It's terrific. So, look, I'm a believer that if you have a great idea, you're passionate about it, I think there's an evolving landscape in India that really enables startups more and more to thrive. And so you should jump deep into it, right? I find oftentimes people worry too much about the risks and weigh the risks and rewards too often. And I think if you're becoming too de-risked about your thinking, you never jump into it fast enough.
Right. Actually, what else were you going to say sitting out here? You made a big mistake. You shouldn't have done it. All right. But on the downsides of it, a lot of people out here working for corporates, a lot of people thinking about, should I get into a startup? And I think it's something that has to be weighed because as a nation, we are putting a lot on the back of startups. Like the government says, we're going to solve our entire unemployment problem because 1 million startups are going to come and suddenly there are going to be jobs for everyone. It's not necessarily quite as simple as that, is it?
No, look, I am personally a huge believer in the opportunity that startups can create for the country in the long term, right? I think if you ask me 15, 20 years from now, I think the startups will do in terms of job creation, in terms of brand building, in terms of wealth creation, what the IT services companies did over the last 15 to 20 years. I think the playground where startups can play is evolving in India, and I think it's maturing more and more, right? I think the government is very thoughtful and trying to bring in regulation that can enable startups to thrive. I think the users of startups also have to come to the table. I think there's got to be, customers who are willing to be the beta customers to build a startup. I think there need to be customers who are willing to be early adopters. I think the availability of capital has to mature, and it's matured tremendously. I think liquidity options have to mature. But I think these are things that take time. But I was at a Economic Times Startup Awards jury a couple of months ago, and there were a whole bunch of veteran startup people on that jury. And there were about 40 startups. I knew maybe 2 or 3 of them, but I was quite amazed that most of these big startup veterans in India didn't know half of these companies. And these are companies that are generating 50, 100, 150 crores of revenue a year, which by no means is small. So there's a very maturing space, I think. And I think it's a great time to be sort of diving in if you have a great idea and sort of going for it.
I'm going to look at that.
I also think, if I may, I also think the maturity of enterprises to consume what startups are creating and producing is changing dramatically.
So that's where I would like to spend some time on the entire interplay between corporates and startups and how they actually can and perhaps increasingly are starting to work together. But to just finish this theme off, do you think it is, however, starting to happen that a lot of people are taking that plunge into the startup world without fully thinking through, that it may be tough, you could run out of money, as Bharat is saying, are you sure you're solving the right problems? Is there a bit of excess hype over it, a slight bubble to that extent, or no?
No, I don't think so. Look, I think maybe a few years ago we used to, if people think the streets are paved with gold, they're not paved with gold, right? And you discover that fairly soon. I will tell you, from a personal company experience perspective, 3-4 years ago, we really worried about people leaving in drones to go and start their own things. And, it's not happened to that extreme. Maybe some people want to weigh the risks more, wait longer for it.
Yeah.
A lot of people who've tried something and said, look, it didn't work out, and come back as well. So, each one finds sort of their own feet on this, I think.
Right. Actually, I'm just tempted. This is a fairly mixed audience. I'm tempted to do a quick show of hands to just sort of get everyone going. How many of you think better to work in a corporate? 1, 2, 3, 4. Come on, be honest here. 7. Okay, how many think it's better to work in a startup?
But how many of them are working in startups?
How many of you are actually working in startups? Okay, fine. That's interesting, because it can be. Actually, I should take Bharat's question forward. Is there a problem to be solved? So did I do the right decision? Is there a problem to be solved? Let me dive into that. How many of you think TV news is becoming unwatchable? Yay. All right, thank you so much. I'm glad I did take the right decision. There is a problem to be solved somewhere, and I'm glad we're there. Okay, fine. I'm reassured now. Right, now let's get back to big companies. Now, companies like yours, 4 years, 5 years ago, this was the entire future of India. Now, when people are talking about startups, it's supposed to be the IT sector taking over the entire world. Outsourcing was going to take over the entire world. Every service job on the planet was going to move to India, and especially in IT. Is that promise still is the promise still there, or is it, because the hype has gone off that a little bit?
No, I think, look, the promise of technology and how disruptive technology is becoming and how pervasive it's becoming in all our lives is very prevalent, right? I think that creates huge opportunities for service companies. I think the nature and manner in which we have to work is disruptively changing, right? But I think if you get it right, there's huge opportunities. One of the things we as large companies have to learn is how do we work with the ecosystem much better? How do we build that very fast-paced ecosystem inside of our companies? And so one of the questions we debate and struggle with a lot is how do you build a startup culture inside of Wipro, instead of a large company? And mind you, to me, it's very different than building a culture of innovation, right? A culture of innovation, a lot of large companies do very well. It's very, very different to me than building a culture which is a startup culture. And I would say that two things that we've got to drive and focus on very aggressively. One is empowerment, right? How do you protect these teams inside of your organizations from the bureaucracy, from the processes, from the humdrum, and from the structure sometimes of a large organization? How do you have a much more breathtaking speed around risk and failure, right? How do you allow teams that are on the ground engaging on that particular project to be making decisions as opposed to the decisions bubbling up into the organization? So that's one, empowerment of teams. The second is agility, right? How do you pivot? How do you shut things down that are not working very, very quickly? How do you have the ability to move very, very fast, which oftentimes large organizations struggle with? And so one of the things large organizations oftentimes debate is, does it make sense to have this outside of the company, but an active part of the company, or have it inside of the organization? I'm personally a believer that you can try and build this inside of the organization because the synergies and the integration with other capabilities that exist inside of a large organization make it very, very powerful to bring it together, as opposed to having something that sits completely outside of your organization where you set up a separate company or you have a large stake as a part of something you're setting up from the grounds up.
So let me just take you up on that, and then we will of course throw this to the audience also at some point. I think having tried that at least once in my life, when we were at NDTV, it's a big television news organization at that time, we said, okay, let's get into digital, and I was asked to take over as the CEO of NDTV.com at that point. It was the effort to try and do a startup in a big TV organization, but the reason it perhaps worked at that time was you were literally allowed to go into the basement as 5 people. It was seen as peripheral to the rest of the business at that time. It was allowed to run unfettered for 4 or 5 years. Nobody really paying attention to it. There's something happening in the basement. And then once it grew to a certain size, it came up. If it's more crucial or core to the company, and lots of other divisions of the company want to come in and interface with that, then it becomes tougher to keep bureaucracy away. Would that be a fair comment?
Yeah. But that's why you've got to work top-down to ensure that doesn't happen, right? You've also give it a certain time window within which you can sort of grow and nurture this before trying to kill it too early as well, right? So there's a right balance between killing ideas and supporting ideas. So for example, we run something internally which we call the Horizon 2, Horizon 3 program, where we fund ideas that can pay off in 6 to 12 quarters, and we completely isolate that team. In fact, one of the things we're now debating is should we set up, for lack of a better word, an accelerator, which is just core to the company, where these 10, 12 ideas that we're nurturing can just sit together, where these teams can come together and exchange ideas. They're completely protected from headcount issues or cost issues or any of that. So you've got to sort of support it top-down and then leave them alone, but at the same time be watchful of how these things are evolving and kill ideas that are not moving fast enough.
So just to sort of play devil's advocate in this, that would work and would probably work really well if those are slightly moonshot ideas, like Google can do with Google X, right? It's a company which is there, it's in Silicon Valley, it's slightly far away, it's within the company, but they're working on ideas. If it is to do with the core of your product, then other divisions would say, well, we want to have a say in this, and my timelines are being held up because that particular startup and that idea, we can't say take another 3 months because some other big expansion plans of Wipro are going to get held up. So that's when you have an issue internally.
No, but look, I think one of the things startups need, right, and when you have a startup or a startup DNA inside the organization is access to customers, right? One of the big values is, we work with 150 of the Fortune 500 companies, and so that's a huge value we bring to startups, which we can talk about in a bit in terms of how we engage with the external startup ecosystem, but that's very important for internal startups or ideas as well, right? They need to be sort of bouncing their ideas off with customers to sort of quickly do a POC, to see the viability of this idea, to then take it forward. So their interest in engaging with the rest of the organization also exists. You've just got to find the right balance, in my view.
So working with outside startups, how simple is that? How easy is that? Because there will be people who will say, we don't control that outside entity. Who knows whether that startup is going to succeed or fail? If it becomes mission critical to what Wipro is doing, can we really trust an outside startup? I'm sure you hear that all the time.
Look, I'll come to startups in a second, but let me make a broader point on just innovation and external innovation, right? I think it is virtually impossible for large companies today to survive if they are not on a systematic basis going to engage the external ecosystem, whether that be startups, whether that be strategic partnerships with large product companies in our case, whether it be academia, whether it be expert networks, whether it be crowdsourcing platforms. If we are not systematically engaging with the ecosystem, we're going to get left behind because the mindset of everything being invented inside an organization, I think, is dead, right? That's one. Two is, look, 3 years ago, we set up something called Wipro Ventures, and our objective purely was not, and I'll be killed for saying this, was not to make returns necessarily, right? But was to find a systematic and structured way of engaging with young companies. Many of our ideas actually come to us from our customers. A customer will say, look, this is a great company, but too small for me to work with them directly, de-risk us. Many of our ideas come to us from our business teams, our practice teams who are in the field, building solutions, who get introduced to an interesting company, and how can we sort of work with them. We started making investments initially purely by accident. The reason we made an investment in our first company was because the startup came to us and said, look, how do I know here doesn't come the big guy who will screw over the small guy, but how do I ensure that our interests are aligned? And so that's how the first one started, frankly. And then we built on that and said, look, hey, if we're going to create value, why don't we sort of capture some of the value that we're creating and build a very strategic partnership? So, every startup we work with, I may think a company makes a great investment, but if our business team don't think they make a great partner, we will never work with them. Every startup we work with, we'll have a specific business plan that is owned by a business owner within Wipro, as well as a business owner of the startup to build a plan over the next, year or so. In our first year, we did 7 deals with our portfolio of startups, 7 proposals and deals that we won. Last year, we did 70. This year, we'll do 140, right? So the ability of large companies to work with smaller companies is also changing, I think, quite disruptively. And that's hugely powerful. The other thing is it's remarkable how much customers love this. Customers want to get a view of what's happening on the cutting edge of technology and how they can participate in it. So very often, we will organize something for our customers, which will be a half-a-day innovation day, where we will say, look, tell us what the 3 problems, not 3 areas of technology, but 3 problems or 5 problems you're looking to solve. And let us put together a day of 5 or 6 really interesting companies that you can meet and engage with. They don't have to be our portfolio companies, but just the fact that we're in the ecosystem, we can sort of connect you with them. So I think that's very exciting. We've got to learn how to manage and work with a young company. Oftentimes the resources of a large company overwhelm a young company, and we've got to find the right balance. But I think it's a mutually win-win situation, and we've done 18 so far, and it's working out pretty well. I'm very excited about the progress we've made.
Obviously, you and your family and your company has also really been one of the biggest forces when it comes to philanthropy and in giving back. So to some extent, is your working with startups going to be ever influenced by that also, impact investing, finding startups that may not be core to your business, but just helping them get started and encouraging them to solve for problems which may be peripheral to what you're doing, but just because you want to give back?
Yeah, I know it's a good question. So at the moment, our focus is on much more grassroots issues like primary education in rural India. So the short answer is no, that from a philanthropic perspective, we're not sort of looking at, how do we work with young companies, but selfishly as a company, we're doing a lot of that, right? So while I talked about the 18 investments we've made, we work with 50 startups in India as a part of our innovation group, right? Just trying to sort of find ways that we can mutually benefit each other. And that's a learning and something that we're very pleased with the progress that has been made.
So I just want to turn to the question on ecosystem, which is something that you touched upon. And obviously, if startups and if this is one of the big areas where we think there's going to be a future, it's incumbent upon us as a nation to create an ecosystem. And there's no reason why we can't do it, replicate what Silicon Valley has done and what the Chinese to some extent have done to build ecosystems around technology, build ecosystems around AI and SaaS and whatever else it is that we want to do. As a company, you said what you're doing. How do you think we're doing as a nation on that?
Look, I think it's early days, but we're moving in the right direction. I think NASSCOM as an association is doing a terrific job in getting engaged on some of these areas. So for example, we were very actively involved with the AI framework that the government just recently announced. We've set up some centers of excellence to work in certain specialty areas. Given the credibility and the brand that NASSCOM has, we get called as a port of call to have discussions on any new area, right? Whether it be AI or 5G or what have you. So the good news is that the government is very serious and focused on this because they realize this is the next wave of growth, value, jobs, etc. The good news is that industry gets to have a voice through NASSCOM because we have credibility and we represent 2,500 companies who are our members. So I'm hugely optimistic and hopeful.
But there is always a but, and that but would be that for all that is being attempted and all the attempts to move the ease of business, there are still challenges. You'll have startups saying, we had angel tax is there and red tape is still there. And there's still bureaucracy and there's still headache and there's still all of those things, so which I'm sure we will keep needing to push back on.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, any change takes time and any sort of, as long as there's an openness to fix things that are not working, I think there's progress. To expect that everything works perfectly at the get-go may be a bit unreasonable. But my clear sense is that the openness of the government to look at all issues that can have impact on innovation, including issues like that are hot at the moment, like data localization and protection. I think there's an openness to have dialogue, which I think is the most important thing, and to listen to industry and to listen to participants to then make progress. So I clearly get that sense.
So are you disappointed with what sometimes comes out that, we've had service companies that have become world beaters and which are world beaters, and that's fantastic. But when it comes to product companies or others, it seems that they grow to a certain stage and then they take the easier path of getting bought out by an American company or a Chinese company or somebody else. Is that something that you think we should worry about, or is that what would be par for the course at this stage of our evolution?
Look, I think those are independent company decisions, but look, I'm very hopeful that the quality of product companies that can come out of India. I think one has to appreciate that the rhythm of a services company and a product company are very different. The risks upfront versus the rewards downstream are very different. The kind of investments you've got to make in brand building and marketing and sales are very different. The ability to get disrupted out in a product company is much higher than it is in a services company. So those are necessarily challenges that you've got to live through. As long as we work as a nation to create an ecosystem that I talked about earlier a little bit, you're already seeing some really good product companies coming out of India. Now, the decision they make to sell out or not, that's a risk-reward based decision. I don't think there's a decision based on whether an Indian product company can make it bin as opposed to an individual product company decision. That's my view.
I'm going to take a couple of questions from the audience, but before I do that, maybe one last question. If you had to worry between two possible sets of problems, joblessness, there'll be so many people unable to get employed, and on the other hand, companies finding it impossible to hire the people they really need. It's interesting you can have both problems at the same time, but that may well be where we could be. Which of the two would worry you more?
The interesting thing is they both are, at least from the perspective of the technology industry, where you need a lot of people and you need people with the right skills. And so we as NASSCOM are hugely focused on something called the Future Skills Program, which is really skilling the next 2 million people from the industry of the 4 million, and then in phase 2 skilling another 2 million people who are sort of just graduates and people from outside the industry. But I would say, look, on a broader topic, and we'll leave it at that, joblessness really worries me. I mean, the number of people coming into the market every month, and the number of jobs that we're creating as a country, I think that's of huge concern. It may be a smaller concern for the technology industry, which is the elite industry, but at a nation level, that's a huge concern, and I would think that would be priority number 1, priority number 2, and priority number 3 for the government.
Right. I think we are. I think we're out of time. So maybe. Okay. Time for a couple of questions. Hands. Anybody? Anybody? Okay. Gentleman there.
I think there's one there.
Okay. Next question. That gentleman there, but first.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, the topic itself is very much interesting. Services plus products and corporates plus startups. It's really promising for us. My question is, now all the services company in India, they are trying to redefine themselves because of the transformation in the technology, in the business model, and things like that. So have you ever seen startups as a threat to corporates and services company, and vice versa?
Yeah, it's a good question. At this stage, the honest answer would be no, not as a threat, but more as a partner. And so we see them as a very, very relevant and important partner that we've got to be nurturing earlier and very honestly. And by the way, I would submit again, the respect with which a large company engages with a small company is not one of unequals. I think it's one of equals. So we have a lot of regard, I would say, as large companies when we work with smaller companies because they're building something terrific. And very quickly, they can flip from being a startup to being a company. Right?
Thank you.
Okay, great. Gentleman there? Yeah.
Hi.
So my name is Animesh. I'm a startup in NLP AI space, a product called NLP Bots. So
You may just want to use the mic so people behind you.
yeah, I'm Animesh from NLP Bots. We're an NLP AI company. So my question is, how does these kind of partnerships protect the startup in terms of IP? So startups have only, 2 things to give. One is their time and IP. So we see that in engagements with large corporates, it takes a lot of time, and also we always fear for our IP if people start trying to duplicate, the efforts of the startups.
Yeah. No, so the IP belongs to you, right? And you've got to have some level of trust and understanding of the institution that you're working with and their ways of working and comfort with that. I think your second point, so I don't hear too much worry about the first point that, look, we're also an owner when we take stakes in those companies, right? So I don't hear too much worry about IP theft. I heard a lot of concern about the second one, right? That it takes a long time to close deals, or we're getting pulled in like 5 different ideas and only one is fructifying. So one of the things we as a large company are trying to be much more thoughtful of is, look, we recognize that you're constrained in terms of time and resources, and you can't focus on 20 ideas like we can. You can focus on 1 or 2. So how do we not disillusion you to work on those 1 or 2 that are relevant? Because mind you, we're equally sensitive that, look, we don't want you to go and tell the next guy that, look, these guys are real idiots to work with, right? Because they don't have any clue of how to work with young companies, so don't work with them. So there's an equally important selfish reason to ensure that your time is well spent. And as a part owner, we want to make sure that you're successful as well. So that's something we're learning to get better at, but it's a struggle for big companies because we're more resource rich than a young company. So.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
I think,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.